Hello. Today in my storytelling playlist, I'm going to discuss drivers and crazies in relation to different places that I've lived. So I moved to Mexico at the end of November, and while trying to find an apartment, I had to stay in some hotels and hostels. And it actually took longer than I thought to find one. So near the end of that time, I was trying to save money because the hotels here are actually quite expensive compared to everything else. So I was kind of bleeding out a lot of money. Because of my work, I needed privacy. So during the week, I would stay in a hotel. And on the weekends, to save money, I would go into a hostel for a couple days. Well, I stayed in a lot of hostels in my time, especially when I was in Asia, traveling around Southeast Asia. There are a lot of hostels. I don't particularly like them. I think they're a cost-effective method, but I like my privacy. Well, in this hostel, I was reminded of my hometown of Detroit. And the reason for that is as soon as I walked into the room that I was going to be staying in, it had 4 bunks in it, I could smell this smell. And it's not an easily describable scent, I'll just say that. It's not like BO or anything like that. It's the smell I associate with people who are down on their luck. And it's a very strange smell. It's kind of sour. I've encountered it 3 different times in my life, 3 different kind of stages of my life. The first time was when I moved into a tenement in Detroit. At that time, I was down on my luck. I don't know if I smelled like that or not, though. But as soon as I walked into this building, I could smell this. It's just such a hard thing to describe. It's, like I said, it's kind of sour. And, the building had a lot of crackheads and heroin addicts in it and stuff. So I don't know if anyone showered. I'm not sure if that's what BO smell turns into over time. Maybe. I'm not really sure. But it's a very distinct smell. And I smelled it in that tenement. And then a few years later, I was living in Portland, Oregon, and a girlfriend and I broke up, and I had to hastily find a place to stay. And so I found this room in this kind of, the only way to describe it was like a flop house until I could find an actual apartment. It was a building that only allowed men inside. So when you went through the front door past the desk, if you had like a woman, it was like, very illegal. But I encountered that smell for a second time there, not through the whole building, but occasionally I would walk by a room and I could kind of smell it coming from the room. Well, the third time was in this hostel that I stayed in. And, I walked in and I looked around and there's this girl there. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know I'd be staying with a girl. Or woman, I should say. She was probably in her mid-20s, late 20s. She was sitting there and she starts speaking to me in Spanish. And I don't know that much Spanish yet. I'm learning. But I could kind of piece together what she was saying. And she switched to kind of broken English. And she sort of described her situation to me. And she was saying something about her father was in the USA and that she had been staying in hostels for the last 6 months. And anyway, I could tell she was in trouble. And at first I was kind of, when someone's in trouble, you want to help them, even if you aren't able to help them, the first impulse is to try to help them. Well, as I started chatting with her more, I started realizing that she wasn't quite all there. And that's why she was in trouble. I wasn't even sure if the story about her father was true, because she was kind of jumping around on all these different stories. Her English wasn't great, so maybe I'm missing something in the translation, but I don't really think so. So she just kept talking and talking, and I was kind of like, okay. You know, at a certain point when you encounter a new person and you're in a strange place, there's a moment where like uncomfortable silence starts to take hold and you just kind of drop the conversation and you go about your business. She would not do that. She just kept talking and talking. And a third person came into the room, another Mexican person, and I could tell he got the sense that this wasn't, right. He was there for a little while and he left, and she started talking to me again. And yeah, I don't know. There's maybe that smell is crazy. I don't know, but I could definitely feel the vibe coming from her, having dealt with it a lot in Detroit and other places. So, I'm in this hostel and I'm like, oh God, now I have to deal with this for 2 days. There was going to be a tree lighting. She mentioned that it started at like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. I can't remember. I could tell she wanted me to invite her to come with me, but I did not want to do that. I couldn't do it. So as this was kind of unfolding, the power went out. It started raining first and then the power went out. So I'm sitting there in the dark and she's just talking and talking and talking. And I actually got this sense that maybe she was going to try to come on to me. It was kind of weird. She like sat on my bunk for a second and I was just like, okay. So yeah, then I was like, I got to get out of here. So I locked my stuff up in one of the lockers and I was like, okay, I'm leaving. I got to go. So it's pouring rain outside. In a normal situation, I probably would have waited for it to stop raining or, waited for the lights to come back on. But I was like, I got to go. So I left. And she was like, in mid talking, I just kind of walked out the door. And so I went to this tree lighting and, it's pouring rain and I don't have an umbrella because I haven't bought one here yet. It doesn't really rain here that often. That was like the only time I can think of that it's rained so far. So I'm just walking in the rain with, no umbrella, in the dark. Everywhere is dark because the power is out over the whole city. And then I get to the tree lighting and, eventually, I talk about this in another video, but eventually the lights come back on and everything. But while I was there, I was worried I was going to run into her. So I was kind of like, looking around a lot and I just didn't want to deal with her. So the following night, other people stayed there and she was weird still. And I just tried to ignore her. I'd put my headphones on, watch a movie on my laptop or listen to music or something and just try to zone her out. And, in Detroit, I dealt with that kind of stuff every day. As far as the drivers, I haven't owned a car in 26 years. And so I've relied on, public transportation, taxis when I can. And, in Asia, in Korea, Uber is very limited. So it's mostly taxis. But when I lived in Vietnam, there would be Grab, motorbike taxis and Grab cars. So I relied on that kind of stuff. And occasionally when you do that, you meet interesting people that are the drivers. Actually, you'd be surprised how many of these people can actually speak really good English abroad, more than you would think. And it's funny. You can go in Korea, you could go into an immigration office and people can speak very, very basic English or no English in the immigration office. Or you can go to a taxi or a convenience store and the person speaks perfect English. And you're like, what is going on here? Why is that happening? I don't know. In my travels, I have had conversations with people. I'm going to start in Detroit because that's, I think, one of the most memorable. I used to live in a city called, it's not really a city, it's a borough called Hamtramck, which is Detroit surrounds it, but it's technically its own city, but it's inside Detroit. And I used to live there, and my job was in another part of the city. So, sometimes I'd ride my bike back and forth, which was quite dangerous, but I did it anyway. But, sometimes I had to work really late because I was a waiter at the time at a bar. And, it wasn't very safe to be riding a bicycle at 3 o'clock in the morning. So sometimes I would do it, but most of the time I would take a taxi home. I'd take the bus there and then take a taxi home. So eventually I got this regular driver. I believe his name was Terry, I think. I can't really remember. It was a long time ago. It was like more than 20 years ago. This guy was a character. If you've ever been to Detroit, or if you know anything about Detroit music, there's a certain kind of, especially like garage rock, there's a certain kind of person that comes from Detroit. If you think of Iggy Pop or the Stooges or the MC5 or maybe some of the bands from like the 2000s, the Detroit Cobras or the Dirt Bombs, people like that, they have a certain look. And this guy, that's what he looked like. He was like this old dude. He was probably at the time I was in my late 20s, he was probably in his 50s. So he lived through a lot of that time. He really liked hockey. I remember that. But he really liked music. And a lot of times taxis will give you a business card once they realize you're not a crazy person or if you have a regular route that you take. So, he gave me his business card and I would call him and he'd pick me up. We get in these conversations, really long conversations about music, about the city, about magic, all kinds of things. Very strange conversations. And sometimes he'd drop me off and we'd sit there in his car and we'd talk for like an hour. I'm not even kidding. Sometimes I was like, I just want to go home because I had worked all night. The conversation was stimulating, but, I was just ready to go home. But other times, I loved it. It was amazing. He was an interesting guy, and he had so many stories. If you know the Weather Underground, Bernadine Dorn, he actually knew her, like all kinds of weird stuff. He was a really interesting guy. In Korea, I didn't encounter that much because of the language barrier. Some Koreans can speak English, but older people usually can't. And a lot of the taxi drivers are older, so they just could never do it. They would try to talk to me, but it would never really amount to much because my Korean wasn't good enough and their English wasn't good enough, so there was only a certain amount of banter that could go on. As far as in Mexico, the reason I bring this up is because the other day I had an Uber ride from a guy, and he actually did not live in my city. He actually drives to the city on the weekends and works, then goes back to Lyon, where his family is. So his English was really good, and we got to talking, and he was pretty funny actually. Yeah, I mean it's one of those moments where I see both sides when I'm out and about in the world. I'll be candid here. On one hand, the other day here, I had a really bad thing happen. Laundry stole my clothes. They stole like 10 items out of my bundle of clothes because a lot of the apartments here don't have washing machines. So I had to take it to a laundry. I think eventually I'm going to buy like a small portable washing machine or something. But I had to take it to the laundry, and I took it to one laundry and it was fine. Everything was fine. But then I took it to this different laundry and she gave it back to me after it was washed. And I was like, that bag looks pretty light. And I was like trying to translate that and ask her. She's like, no, that's everything. It's just folded or whatever. I'm like, okay. So I leave and I go home and I look through my stuff, and lot of my clothes are missing. I'm like, oh my God, okay. Thankfully, they didn't take the stuff I really like, but they definitely took stuff I need. Because, I just moved here from overseas, so a lot of my clothes aren't even here yet. I had them packed up and they're going to be shipped here. So I'm on like a backpack basically, and now, probably a third of my clothes are gone. So I go back, thinking that it's maybe a mistake. She's like, no, I don't have your clothes. I'm like, yeah, I brought you 2 bags. This is what you did, blah, blah, blah. She's like, no, I don't have your clothes. She didn't even look. She just said no. I'm like, okay. So then there's another guy there, and he starts translating a little bit for me. And, he was dropping his laundry off, and he was kind of like, okay, this is odd. And I don't know if it was because I was a foreigner, because, a lot of people come here as tourists. So maybe she thought I wouldn't come back. As much as I complained, and I'm not really a complainer when it comes to that kind of stuff, but I needed these clothes, so I was kind of pressing it. And yeah, she just said no, that she doesn't have them. So then I was faced with a decision, like, should I contact the police? But in my experience, being abroad as a traveler or as an expat, it's never good to have the police involved. Because 9 times out of 10, they're going to side with the local. That's just, I've seen it happen so many times, even if the local is in the wrong. So yeah, I don't know. I decided not to press it because I'm like, it's just some clothes. I can get them later. A lot of them are older anyway. It's just the principle of it. That was a negative experience. This taxi was a positive experience, and it just goes to show that you can have, very everywhere you go, there are good people and there are bad people, or there's degrees. Everyone's a little bit good, a little bit bad, but there are opposite ends of the spectrum. And the taxi driver, he was giving me some tips on Spanish, on pronunciation. He was telling me where to go. He was saying that Mexican women are going to like me because of my gray eyes and all this stuff. And I was just like, okay. And yeah, he was a really cool guy. And you get that, and then you get the bad. And that's just part of the process. I guess the point of all this is that no matter what city you live in, you're going to meet good people, and you're going to meet crazy people, or you're going to meet bad people. And that's just the way it is. So that's all I got for this one. It's about the new year, so Happy New Year. And I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.